And welcome back. We're at part 3 of the PEP Radio special report on government shutdowns, past and present. So far, we've talked about all kinds of things. We've talked about President Trump sort of staying in the background, traveling all over Asia, demolishing the East Wing of the White House so that he can build this maybe $350 million ballroom that's being paid for by private donors, but is going to cost taxpayers ad infinitum for as long as the thing is standing. We've talked about cuts to SNAP benefits. We've talked about those getting frozen effective Friday night at midnight going into Saturday morning. So as of November 1st, SNAP benefits across the country are being cut because the government's in a shutdown. We talked about the concept of the government shutdown. Back in 1975, when President Ford experienced his first government shutdown and his only government shutdown, it didn't last very long. It was very short-lived. And under the Carter administration, there were 5 different shutdowns that lasted in total, 13 days. Ronald Reagan, when he was president, he didn't have the support of Congress. So he and Congress bickered back and forth, but they knew how to come to consensus, and they knew that there were steps they could take to make sure that government services weren't stopped. And all of this is a direct result of a decision made by Benjamin Civiletti back in 1980. And at the time, Benjamin Civiletti was the Attorney General under President Jimmy Carter. And he referred back to an act passed in 1870 that prevents government spending when funds run completely dry. So it's not as if they can keep digging the well deeper and deeper and hope to draw more water out of it to be able to pay the bills that are being generated by the federal government. So this leads to a lot of good questions. The budget impasse, the continuing resolution, requires that Republicans and Democrats both sign off on it in the Senate. It's already passed the House of Representatives. It's sitting in the Senate, and they need 60 votes to get past the threshold, to get past the filibuster, right? So up to this point, we have Senator John Fetterman voting for passing the continuing resolution. And John Fetterman is the Democrat from Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, Senator Rand Paul, the Republican senator from Kentucky, has consistently voted against the measure. So Republicans have to have all 53 of their senators on board to be able to pass the continuing resolution and reopen the government. Meanwhile, the Democrats are objecting because at the end of the current calendar year, on December 31st, subsidies to help keep health insurance premiums low for people who rely on the Affordable Care Act and who rely on other programs like CHIP, and they're getting funding through the federal government to be able to pay for the needs that they have, those funds are going to run out at the end of the year because the pandemic era funding is scheduled to expire on December 31st, 2025. So without an assurance from Senator John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is not willing to negotiate. He wants to make sure, absolutely sure, that they will take up a resolution to extend those benefits for one more year to allow people to be able to breathe and to be able to go into the new year knowing that they're not going to face a massive increase in their health insurance premiums. Seems reasonable. In fact, in previous administrations under President Clinton vetoed a continuing resolution back in the 1990s because Congress was going to stop particular Medicare subsidies from flowing to the states and flowing to the people that needed them. Now it's Medicaid subsidies, or those under the Affordable Care Act, to be able to protect people who need their health insurance. So that's really what's stalling the government from reopening. Now, given that background, in our final segment, we will talk about what happens next. What are the various services provided in whole or in part that will be impacted by the government shutdown? And among them are SNAP benefits. That is most definite. And among them are pay for soldiers and sailors and Marines. So military personnel need to be paid. Air traffic controllers need to be paid. What about people who are furloughed? Are they going to get paid? Are they going to get back pay once they return to work? President Trump says no. Senator Schumer says they darn well better get paid. And that was a bone of contention under previous administrations. Now, again, we explained. President Obama went through this a time or two. President Joe Biden never had to deal with this because he never had a government shutdown. President George W. Bush had a minor government shutdown, but that was because of 9/11, not Congress and not the budget. President Clinton went through a few shutdowns of his own, and he got through them fairly rapidly, although at the time, the shutdowns under the Clinton administration were some of the longest ever. Now, I mentioned air traffic controllers and TSA agents. Well, these folks are getting unpaid, and they're beginning to call in sick more and more frequently. So, what travel delays should be anticipated ahead of the Thanksgiving holiday? Okay, let's set all that aside for the moment. To get to the negotiating table, we have to have some assurances. So, what steps will House Speaker Mike Johnson, the Republican from Louisiana, and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, the Democrat from New York, what steps will they take to minimize the impact of the shutdown, if they can do anything at all? And equally important, what steps are states taking to be able to assure that people can have food on their tables throughout the month of November, especially at Thanksgiving, as families are gathering for various Thanksgiving feasts all across the country? Let's get to that right now. Millions of Americans will not receive food stamp benefits as of Saturday, November 1st, today, because that's when this show is airing first. November 1st, because of the government shutdown. No food stamps, no SNAP benefits. The Trump administration warns as impacts threaten very soon to hit many more Americans that the people will potentially ramp up pressure on lawmakers to reach a deal to end the standoff. And again, I've already explained what the steps and what the prerequisites are to get to said deal. And they include, gotta have a reassurance that health insurance premiums aren't going to skyrocket come January 1st. Gotta have some reassurance that furloughed workers are going to have their jobs after the government shutdown ends, and they're going to get back pay. They're going to get paid for the time they were away in some fashion. Will the military get paid? As of October 30th, more federal workers are expected to miss their first full paychecks. After the first batch of federal workers were not paid Friday, and air traffic controllers missed their first full paychecks Tuesday, yeah, there's been a lot of grumbling. A lot. And that's why more air traffic controllers are calling in sick. And military members, they cannot exactly grumble. To whom are they going to grumble? Their commanding officers, their battalion commanders. I mean, to whom are they going to complain? The Department of Defense? Well, Pete Hegseth doesn't care. He doesn't. I'm sorry, he just simply doesn't. On October 31st, military members are scheduled to receive paychecks. And that's become a sticking point, you see, because that money is coming from a $5 billion contingency fund that we're going to talk about in a little bit. It's unclear if they will get that money from that contingency fund. House Speaker Mike Johnson, the Republican from Louisiana, said Monday, "We're not 100% sure." While Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CBS on Sunday, "I think we'll be able to pay them beginning in November." Why not on October 31st when it's due? It's due. These are currently serving members of the United States military who are going without pay after having served their country for a full month. They are actively serving now. Or they're in the National Guard and they're deployed in cities like Washington, D.C., and Portland, Oregon, and Los Angeles, and Chicago, and on, and on, and on, because Donald Trump felt it necessary to attack cities in which we really did not need additional National Guard troops, because all that did was further inflame the people who were protesting the poor decision-making processes of the Trump administration in the first place. The Defense Department previously shifted $8 billion in research and development funds to pay military in mid-October, but the money is not enough to cover the October 31st paychecks. Oops. November 1st, Affordable Care Act open enrollment begins, and premiums will increase by an average of 30% if they are not extended. One of the Democrats' demands for reopening the government is making sure that those ACA premiums don't go up as of January 1st. But the government has to show those window watchers that are looking at what health insurance premiums they can afford, how much they're going to have to pay in the coming year. And this is going to impact folks who do not rely on Medicaid and aren't getting Medicare. Or those that have Medicare but can't get Medicaid because they make too much money per year, like yours truly. November 1st, nearly 42, emphasis on this, 42 million people, that's 1 out of every 8 Americans, enrolled in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program will not receive food stamps. They will not get their benefits. The Department of Agriculture said that in a notice on its website, writing, "Bottom line, the well is run dry," pressuring Democrats to vote for the government funding bill and calling the date an inflection point for Senate Democrats. That's not all that USDA website says. They talk about blaming Democrats who want to fund health care for undocumented migrants and gender mutilation. So they're attacking the transgender and non-binary communities, and they're going after undocumented migrants and saying that you're not getting your SNAP benefits because of migrants and trans people. That is utter crap. And they know it. Furthermore, it's a violation of the Hatch Act, which says that federal employees cannot use partisan language when dealing with or expressing official matters to the public. They have to stay nonpartisan. And the USDA didn't do that. November 5th, the shutdown will become the longest in history, beating a 35-day record set by none other than Donald Trump in his first term in office in 2018 and 2019. November 15th, military members would not receive their scheduled paychecks because Scott Bessent told CBS on Sunday that by November 15th, our troops and service members who are willing to risk their lives are not going to be able to get paid. What about Amtrak? Thanksgiving's coming up. Will people be able to get to their destinations if they're traveling by train? As of November 27th, which is Thanksgiving Day, the days leading up to and after the holiday are among the busiest travel days of the year. The shutdown has already prompted flight delays as airport staffers who are working without pay, such as Transportation Security Administration, all those workers, TSA agents, and air traffic controllers have been calling in sick because they figure if we're not going to get paid, why show up? During the previous government shutdown in Trump's first term, airport staffing shortages that led to flight delays were widely viewed to be a key factor in Trump's decision to end the shutdown. Amtrak rail travel, however, is unlikely to be affected by the shutdown, according to the Rail Passengers Association, since Amtrak has enough cash on hand to continue operating normally. Amtrak infrastructure projects, however, could be affected by any pause in federal funding from the Department of Transportation if the shutdown continues to drag on, and it likely will. What about those SNAP benefits? Let's talk about those. 25 states plus Washington, D.C. sued the Trump administration on Tuesday to prevent food stamps from being withheld Saturday, arguing the Department of Agriculture is obligated to use emergency funding to provide the benefits. The agency said last week it would not use the reserve funding, arguing it's legally available. Well, no, it isn't actually. They say it's not. Instead, they're going to use it for purposes such as disasters. Guessing here, maybe one of the leading disasters is probably the impact of Hurricane Melissa, which slammed into Jamaica, the Caribbean, and Cuba. But I thought Trump was all about America first. Lawmakers and political leaders in several states, including Governor Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, are also making plans to partially fill the gap for SNAP and funding it after federal funds are cut off. Governor Shapiro is going to make sure that food banks and food pantries around Pennsylvania continue to get money to be able to purchase food, to be able to supply the people with what they need. Governor Shapiro is doing something else. He's part of a lawsuit filed by 25 states in the District of Columbia to get the U.S. Department of Agriculture to issue food stamp money from that $5 billion contingency fund. Meanwhile, Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry has endorsed a $150 million plan to cover SNAP funding for some recipients in early November, while Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, he has declared a state of emergency and created a new state program intended to maintain the benefits. What about New York Governor Kathy Hochul? Well, she's announced $30 million in emergency funding to go toward food assistance. And meanwhile in California, Governor Gavin Newsom's office has said it will be fast-tracking $80 million in state funds toward food banks, and the governor will also be deploying the National Guard to assist food banks, rather than sending them to ICE facilities in Los Angeles or up to Portland, Oregon, where Governor Tina Kotek says they're not needed. Governor Gavin Newsom is going to be sending the National Guard to food banks to make sure that the volunteers who work in those food banks have all of the physical on-hand assistance they need to assure that the very long lines of very hungry people get the food items that they need to be able to continue to keep food on their tables for themselves and their families. The USDA has warned states that they will not be reimbursed for providing funding to cover food stamps during the shutdown. They're not. It's going to food banks instead. They're bypassing the system. So what happens next at this point is anyone's guess. The impasse of the continuing resolution in the Senate will very soon have a dramatic impact on households all across the country. If the history of government shutdowns shows us anything, this one appears to be the most difficult for most Americans. And that's our show, folks. Thank you for listening. If you are watching the YouTube version of our 3-parts special report, we ask you to subscribe to our channel. Stand with Pride on Pep Radio will be coming back next week at its regular time. Coming up next at the top of the hour, we have the Smokers Lounge, right here on Pep Radio.